So then I looked around to see, I said Horatio Hough was such a man, and without his heroic actions, his cave would have been just another hole in limestone. I mean, it certainly wouldn't have been famous if we didn't think that it was used to hide slaves. He was the oldest son of Horatio Gates and Martha Pitcher Hough. And they came out of Connecticut and relocated first to Constableville and then later to Martinsburg. And they basically, as far as I know, came first to Constableville, like I said. But when they settled in Martinsburg, they settled on that property that is still basically known as Hough's Farm. And that's where Horatio Hough was born in 1809. He was the oldest. He had a younger brother who was much more famous than he, Franklin Hough, and he also had two sisters as well. Horatio apparently married Lydia Calkins Crandall in 1833, and he never left the home that he was born in. So from the time he was born in that house in Martinsburg, that's the house he was living in when he also died. And he was a very religious person, and he joined the Presbyterian Church at an early age. And during that period in the 1800s, in the 1830s and so forth, there was a big religious revival going on called the Second Great Awakening. And it was a whole new, it was a birth of a whole new kind of church, one that basically promoted activism, social activism. They said it wasn't good enough just to live a good life and keep the commandments and that kind of thing, but you really had to get out there and do something to right wrongs and make things better. And so that was a big part of their belief. And he, more than likely, we can't prove it, although they did mention a Great Awakening in his obituary, that's probably where he began to get his strong feelings, because that particular church revival was focused heavily on anti-slavery and abolitionist activity. So this is probably where he got the idea or the impetus to be an abolitionist. There were many meetings of these ministers who came. They came out of Connecticut, but they also were very active in New York. There were revival meetings in Rome and Utica, and it's very likely that he traveled there and listened to those sermons and those meetings. According to the Hough's history of Lewis County, which was written by his brother Franklin, the Lewis County Anti-Slavery Society was formed in August of 1835. And I haven't found anywhere the list of names of people who belonged to that society, but I would be very surprised if Horatio Hough's name was not there. He was working actively with his own church, the Presbyterian Church in Martinsburg, trying to get them, he had a petition he presented to them, trying to get them to make a statement, a stand against slavery as part of what they were promoting, and they would not do it. And he kept trying to convince people to do that. And they were getting quite annoyed with him because he just continued to do this even though they had decided they weren't going to make that determination. He wanted them to go on record as opposing the practice of slavery. The session deliberated in the church, and then as I said, they decided not to. It's interesting to note that one other member of the church, a Mr. A. Foote, voted against the otherwise unanimous decision. So he was one that sympathized with Horatio. And it's also noted that on December 7th of 1850, Horatio sends a $5 donation along with $5 from Elder A. Foote to the Mines Mission, a known anti-slavery organization. So the two of them were obviously very much immersed in anti-slavery thoughts and actions. In late January in 1844, Horatio Hough was formally suspended from the communion of his church until he gave evidence of penitence. And there's no evidence that he ever did show any penance for that. And by the mid-1850s, he had formed another church with a bunch of like-minded individuals called the Church of Martinsburg. And I've never been able to figure out exactly where that was. It said it was it had a view of the Black River Valley, and it was like a chapel. I don't know exactly where it was, but it's no longer there. I do know that it's gone. But he and several others were listed. He was one of the 9 trustees, and I'm sure there were other members as well. According to his obituary notice, his feelings, his anti-slavery feelings were very, very important to him. And he, one of the things he feared most was that he might die before the slaves were actually freed. And he found that very troublesome. And when it turned out that he didn't die, he made statements thanking God that he had been permitted to live till his country was in fact, as in name, the land of the free and the home of the brave. So he was very grateful that he lived long enough to see that. His father was a doctor. Horatio Gates Hough was a doctor. He was the first doctor in Lewis County. And so I kind of allowed for that when I wrote the book that I wrote about the slavery, anti-slavery activity and so forth is called With Thunder Rolls. And I kind of used that information, knowing that he was a doctor, to assume that perhaps he had some nice furnishings in his home more than a simple farmer might have. And so if I put a rosewood desk in the office, that seemed appropriate, because wouldn't a doctor want to look, to have something like that as part of his furniture and his furnishings in his home. As far as what the cave was exactly like, it's very difficult to tell. It's full of fieldstone and has been for many years. There are, I think, 1 or 2 people who still remember being in the cave at one point in time, or talking to someone who was in the cave. I think the best description comes from a newspaper account, I have it here, that seems like it would be the most likely, because it came from an eyewitness, Mrs. Ida Damus, who was Ida Lee, who lived across the road. Her father and his family lived across the road from Horatio. And she remembered as a child seeing the wagon go out at night in the dark with his probably cargo of slaves that he might have hidden in a false bottom. And she told her son, Roy Damus, who owned, according to this article, in the 1930s, I think it was 1931, he owned the farm at that time, that she had seen the old swayback horse start out at night with his wagon load and so forth. As a boy, Roy Damus went into the cave, and so I think this is probably a pretty accurate description, because he would be an eyewitness. He recalls an old boat some 20 feet back from the entrance, and that the cave contained around 3 feet of water. And he says whether the boat is still there or not is not known, nor is its purpose in the cave. Gradually, the entrance has been filled up with large and small stones, and it has been many years since any have penetrated the interior. I think the boat was there. I think there was water in the cave, but I don't think the cave was full of water. In the springtime, in that particular area, there's a lot of limestone there. There's a lot of aquifers in that area. And when you have the spring melt and so forth, I'm sure at that time the cave was probably full of water, and you probably wouldn't have been able to go in there. But in the summer, he's saying the boat was 20 feet back from the entrance. Well, he must have been standing on something solid to see that. if he went into the cave to see it, right? He couldn't be standing in 3 feet of water or whatever to see it. So it would seem to me that in the summertime, when there was less water flowing, that you would have been able to walk on the rock area or the hard ground area, whatever you might call it, and that maybe beyond that there was water, and that's why there was a boat. And you can just imagine, or at least I can imagine, that if he had the slaves hidden in there, that boat was there so that if somebody was coming, they could row themselves back farther in the cave, which supposedly went as far as under the road, and would be out of sight. And that makes sense to me. I don't know if that makes sense to you. I can't prove it, but, you know, it seems like it's a logical thing. I mean, why would he put them down there if it was full of water? I mean, it couldn't be full of water when they were down there. And they did say that most of the time he probably kept them in his house, and that he mostly would put them in the cave if he thought there was a chance somebody was going to be coming to catch them. Now, we did have slave catchers coming from the south all the time, and they could take slaves, and it was against the law for you to stop them from doing so. So, you know, it was a matter of basically cat and mouse, that they had to be taken in under cover of darkness, they had to be hidden during the daytime, and you were always in fear that, you know, somebody's going to stop you and ask what you had in your wagon and that kind of thing. I don't know if I could have done it myself, because I'm one of those people that gets very nervous when I'm doing things I'm not supposed to do. And if I'm afraid of being caught, you know, that would make it even worse. I don't know, I would probably inadvertently give it all away without meaning to. But, so that basically is about the cave. There was some writing too, another writing that was done in the 1950s, which is pretty far removed from the actual time when the cave was visible, mentioned that it was commodious and large. Some people have thought that it went all the way to the Black River on the other side. I don't know if it did, but it didn't sound like, when he was talking about it, I think he said, let's see, they talked about the east entrance and the west entrance. Maybe it wasn't this particular one, but it sounded as though the main entrance was the west entrance, and that one was way back by the barn. There is a tree back there. There is a pile of rocks back there. And that's basically what they said was the actual entrance to the cave. And then in the east, there was an entrance in the east, which would have been across the road. So I don't believe myself that there was an entrance at the road where now you see that sign. Well, of course, now it's moved up the road a ways again, so it's not even really near where the cave was. But it looks to me like perhaps at some point when they were building or rebuilding the road, they may have broken through the cave. And that's where you see a hole there. But I don't think that was the opening. Yes?
My dad one time was able to get in there with somebody, and there is that opening there by the sign there now.
Yeah.
And that's where he was able to get in with it. And then I talked to somebody not long ago, probably 2 or 3 years ago. But my dad is probably in there 50 years ago. And they said that the cave goes both sides of the road and under more than one real estate owner. One was willing to have it developed and the other didn't want any part of it.
Yeah, well that's when we were looking into trying to get it listed as a historic site. But if we, you know, that's because the large farm there just didn't want to get involved with it. But it really isn't necessary because the opening to the cave is up by the barn and that landowner is interested. And that's something we've been, kind of working on with the state representative, trying to get it listed as a National Historic Site. It sounds silly to have a hole in the ground listed, but it would be nice if we could get some geological survey done, maybe, I think Fort Drum does stuff like that, where they can use some kind of imaging to visualize under the ground what's there. That would be nice if we could get something like that. And even if you only opened that one end and then covered it so no one could get in there and get hurt, but at least could see into the opening if you cleaned part of it out, so that you could let people know that that was a very important historic place in Lewis County and in the whole state at that time. It's hard to actually describe because I've not been in there, and no one has for many, many years. Does anybody have any other questions or comments on it? Well, I have some handouts for those who haven't gotten them yet. I put in a bibliography of the books that I used when I wrote my book, When Thunder Rolls, which is a fictional account of Underground Railroad activity in Lewis County. I didn't use all the spots in Lewis County. In the book, I focused on the Talketville Mansion or the Stone House or whatever you want to call it. And I focused on the Collins House, and I focused on Hough's Cave. But in the part about Hough's Cave in the book, it's already beyond the time of using it, because that only went on until the Civil War started. And when the Civil War started, then the slaves stopped coming. So I used it as a picnic spot after that effect, and then he could visualize saw little scraps of things there, like buttons and things like that that were left behind in the cave. Whether they really are or not, I can't say. But it's interesting to see the chronology of the anti-slavery movement in America. A lot of, some people, I wouldn't say a lot, some people wanted to abolish slavery at the time this country began. But there were others that didn't want to, and we were a group of colonies, north and south, and of course the South depended more heavily on the existence of slavery and their health and so forth, and they really weren't, in favor of it at that time. The first abolitionist society was organized by Benjamin Franklin in 1775, so there were already people who were interested in getting rid of it. And but then in 1793, this is the hard part, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, making it a crime to assist an escaped slave, and permitting masters of slave catchers to seize runaways, even in free states. And they could come into it, New York State outlawed slavery in 1827, but they could come into the state and they could literally take any person of color that was around. And there might even be a person who was a free person, who was maybe born free, and maybe the parents were free for whatever reason, and it didn't matter, and they could protest all they want. They went south to slavery. So it was a terrible, terrible, I don't know what you want to say, situation. And so you can see why people were so determined to try to rescue people and get them out of here, get them out of New York State, and get them out of the United States, because the only place where they could truly be free was in Canada. And so that's where the Underground Railroad led to, was up to Canada. And one of the other researchers told me that the runaway slaves at that time called it glory. And so they'd say they were going to glory because they were going to be free in Canada. Another big problem was the Dred Scott case, and if you're interested in reading about that, I brought in one thing. I don't know if somebody picked it up or not, or maybe I left it up here, I guess, because I only have one copy, about the Dred Scott case. And that was, some people probably are aware of it already, but it was a black man who had lived with his master in a free state for a long period of time, and so he felt like he should be free. And then when they moved back to a slave state, you know, he had to go. He couldn't stay. He wanted to stay behind in the free state. So he somehow or other got a lawyer and brought suit for his freedom based on the fact that he was living for all these years in a free state. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court wrote their decision. And if you want to read the decision in detail, you go on the Library of Congress website and take a no-dose before you start. I looked at it last night. It was like 96 pages because I thought at one time of printing it out and I thought, oh my Lord. But in reading it and you hear everything that's in there, all the arguments that were made, all the reasons against, reasons for, deciding in his favor and all of those things. But the bottom line was, the end decision was that this man was not a citizen of the United States. And because he was not a citizen of the United States, he couldn't bring suit in the courts of the United States. And there was nothing that would change his situation. In other words, once a slave, always a slave. You could live in Michigan, which was a free state. You could live in New York, which was a free state. Didn't matter. If you were a slave at any time in your life, or could be perceived possibly to have been a slave, you were the property of your owner, and that was the end of that. And they did not feel in their arguments that the government, and I kind of laughed at that because I look at today and think, oh well, the government had no right to separate a person from his property. So it's too bad that doesn't apply to some of the things that the government separates us from today. But so that made it even worse because then there was no freedom in this country anywhere because the Supreme Court said so. Not everyone abided by that, and certainly the abolitionists did not, but it was going against the law to come between the slave owner and his property. And what could you, I can't remember there was a huge fine for those days. It was like a $500 fine, which to people who didn't have any wealth would find a hard time paying back in 1859 or 58. And also, besides that, a jail sentence. And so you could learn, you know, while you were in jail, unable to work your farm or whatever, you probably would, you know, end up losing your farm. Your family wouldn't be able to support themselves. So it was quite a risk to get involved with this illegal activity. And looking at the chronology of anti-slavery activity in New York State, in 1799, they passed a Gradual Emancipation Act. It freed all slave children born after the 4th of July in 1799. But however, they were kept as indentured servants until they became adults. And I think it was the New York State Historical Society website said young adults, but when I looked up the actual age, they were like 25 or 30 before they could stop being an indentured servant and be actually freed. Then in 1817, they put in a new law that freed slaves born before 1799, but they wouldn't actually be free until 1827. And I don't know why, maybe just to allow people to adjust to that whole idea before they became free. But in 1827, that was the end of slavery in New York State. And just to show the decrease, it said in 1830, the federal census showed 75 states, 75 slaves in New York State, most of them in New York City. And by 1840, there were no slaves in New York City. and probably nowhere else either. So it did work. And in 1835, that was the first meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society at Peterborough. And that's now the National Abolition Museum and home of the Garrett Smith Estate National Historic Landmark. And it's on the National Park Service Underground Railroad Trail, the Network to Freedom. So when I wrote my book, I'll just read just a little bit. I tried to imagine what it would actually be like to be in the middle of rescuing slaves, especially if you didn't really want to. Because the main character in this story was very much afraid that his father would get caught and that he would end up in jail, and then this boy would never be able to leave home. He would be there taking care of the family for the rest of his life. So he really didn't like doing it. So I'll just read you this little bit of chapter 1. The sound of galloping hooves brought Luke to his feet. Horses snorted and blew under his window. He peered through the smeared glass. He couldn't see a thing in the pitch-black darkness, but he knew what was happening down there, and he wanted no part of it. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain pattered on the roof as he yanked up his breeches. He pounded down the stairs, pulling on his shirt as he ran. "Take the lantern, Luke," his mother said, holding it out at the bottom of the stairs. Except for the lantern and a single oil lamp in the parlor window, the house was dark. It had to be. This was a business best conducted in the shadows. A bolt of jagged lightning lit the dooryard as Luke opened the door. In that brief flash of light, a stark scene burned into his eyes. Even after the dooryard plunged back into darkness, the image remained, sketched in brilliant light against the inky black sky. The sack of potatoes on the ground, the Negro woman Pa held by the arm, the squirming bundles she clutched to her breast. Luke hunched his shoulders and stepped out into the rain. He ran to the wagon and took hold of the woman's arm. Thunder rumbled through the hills behind them. "Come with me," he said, pulling her into a run. Lightning lit up the stone mansion across the road, the white wooden columns and shutters dazzling in the flash of light. "Oh, Lordy," the woman said. She stopped running and set her heels on the greasy mud. Luke raised the lantern and peered at her. She stared at the stone house, trembling. "Is that the Massa's house?" she whispered. "Nah, that's just the Talcott house," Luke said. He tugged on her arm, but she wouldn't budge. The rain came down in torrents. Thunder reverberated. A booming drum rolled that shook the ground beneath their feet. But the woman just stood there, still as Lot's wife. Luke smelled her fear, but he had to get her moving so he could get her inside the hiding hole. "Come on," he yelled, jerking her arm. The baby wailed and squirmed. "I done gone as far as I can," she cried, falling to her knees in the mud. "For Lord's sake," she was trying to put the baby to her breast. "Get up," Luke hissed. "We've got to keep going. Somebody could be out looking for you." He yanked her to her feet and took off running, dragging her along behind. "Please, Massa," she said. "I ain't your Massa," Luke said. "I'm just the hired help." He scowled at the dark windows of the stone house as they raced by. The rich folks get to sleep at night, he thought, while me and Pa do their dirty work. The baby wailed louder. The next flash of lightning lit the child's face and the tiny fist that flailed in search of milk and comfort. Luke pitied the babe, but if the slave catchers caught up with them, that child would never draw another breath of free air. So instead of stopping, he ran faster. When he reached the barn, he opened the door and drew them inside. A low growl rumbled like muted thunder. The woman stiffened and pulled back. "That's just old Bub," Luke said, propelling her past the dog to the manger. He hung the lantern on a nail, lifted a forkful of hay from the floor, and ran his hand over the bare spot to find the metal ring. He pulled on the ring, grunting as he lifted a large stone from the floor. The hole beneath the stone was barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. Bub snuffled at the hole, tail wagging. "Get in there," Luke said to the woman. "No," she cried, shrinking back. Her brown eyes darted from him to the dark hole. She clutched her baby closer. Maybe she can't climb down and hold on to the child at the same time, he thought. Thunder shook the floor as he pulled the baby from her arms. "Don't take my child," she cried. Then she screamed, an ear-splitting screech that went on and on. The baby wailed, cheeks scarlet with rage. Luke had to do something. If it wasn't for the thunder, folks would hear her all the way to Boonville. He thrust the baby back at her. She stopped screaming and cradled the babe in her arms, crooning softly. The barn door creaked open. A gust of wind prickled the hair on the back of Luke's neck. He clamped one hand over the woman's mouth and pulled her down behind the stanchion. He wrapped his other hand around Buck's muzzle and held his breath. That's chapter 1. But it kind of was, you know, that scary.
Can you tell us some more about some of these other houses?
I can't tell you a lot because I didn't research a lot. The Collins house in, apparently when the slaves came through from Boonville, Utica area, they came first to Barrett's Hotel, which apparently stood near where the radio station, WBRB radio station is today. It's right where the road lies, and one way it goes to the West Road and Constableville, and the other way it goes to Talkerville. So apparently, right there in Barrett's Hotel, that was one of the stations. And I did find in an old Lewis County Historical Society journal a nice article about that, about Barrett's Hotel. And so I was able to use that, and that's where